Gary Olson's koi pond was poisoned, every fish dead. The water turned toxic overnight. Behind it all stood HOA President Mark Pendleton, a control-obsessed retiree who thought no one would question his quiet sabotage. But Gary, a retired EPA biologist, knew exactly where to look and what to expose. Just wait until you hear what the Hazmat team dug up in Mark's backyard and how justice finally made its way to the surface. Gary Olson had always started his mornings the same way since retirement, coffee in hand, boots on, and a slow walk out to the pond behind his house. It wasn't just a routine, it was a ritual. The koi would usually gather near the shallow edge, their orange, gold, and white scales flickering under the water's surface like living gems. They recognized his footsteps. Some of them, like Big Red and Calypso, had been with him for over a decade. But that morning the water was wrong. It was cloudy, milky, almost chalky, and the usual playful ripples were gone. Gary froze mid-step. Something was floating. Several somethings. As he got closer, his heart sank. Dozens of koi, motionless, limp, some twisted at odd angles, were scattered across the pond like fallen leaves after a storm. A few had washed up near the edges, mouths slightly open. The water stank. It wasn't the earthy scent of algae or summer pond life. It was acrid, chemical, foreign. Before he could process what he was seeing, he heard footsteps on the back porch. Lucy. His daughter had come home from college for the weekend. She stopped beside him, still in pajamas, and took one look. Her face crumpled. No, Dad, what happened? Gary didn't answer. He couldn't. He was a scientist by training, spent 30 years with the EPA cleaning up industrial sites across the country. But in that moment, he wasn't a professional. He was a father watching his daughter cry over something they'd built together. That pond wasn't just a hobby. After Gary's wife passed from cancer 6 years ago, the project gave them something to hold on to. It was a place of peace and purpose. Every rock had been placed by hand, every plant chosen to encourage balance. That ecosystem had been thriving. And now, it was dead. Still on autopilot, Gary crouched beside the water, dipping a finger into the edge. His expression shifted from grief to confusion. There was a strange residue near the rocks, a white, almost crystalline dust. His eyes followed it and spotted something more disturbing. A faint trail running across the soil, leading to the fence line behind the pond. There, hidden behind a bush, was a small puncture in the wooden planks, just wide enough for someone to reach through. The edges were fresh, like they'd been sawed or drilled. His gut twisted. This wasn't a random accident. Back inside, he opened the mailbox more out of habit than intent, and found the envelope. No stamp, just folded paper slid in by hand. Gary unfolded it, eyes narrowing with each line. You've been warned about unauthorized landscaping. Final notice. Action taken. Signed at the bottom, Mark Pendleton, HOA President. Gary stood still for a long time. The fish, the residue, the hole in the fence, the timing. There was no question anymore. This had been done on purpose. Mark Pendleton had always fancied himself the guardian of order in the neighborhood. After retiring from a 30-year accounting career that nobody missed, he had redirected all that meticulous energy into running the HOA like it was a personal kingdom. Clipboard in hand, Bluetooth earpiece always blinking, he patrolled the sidewalks like a beat cop, only less friendly and more entitled. He'd taken issue with Gary Olson from day one. It wasn't just the koi pond. It was the rain barrels, the solar panels, the wildflowers Gary planted instead of keeping a manicured HOA-approved lawn. Everything Gary did had intention, practical, ecological, peaceful. But Pendleton saw it as rebellion, an insult to his authority, and Pendleton didn't tolerate noncompliance. Gary had stood his ground every time, calmly, respectfully, but firmly. The rainwater system was within legal environmental rights. The solar panels had state backing. The koi pond had been approved 15 years ago by a different board. Pendleton didn't care. He wanted conformity, and Gary was the one house that refused to fold. Neighbors began to talk, not loudly but often. They whispered that Mark had a connection to a local landscaping company, one angling to score a neighborhood-wide maintenance contract, one that would eliminate natural habitats in favor of uniform gravel beds and synthetic turf. Gary's backyard oasis didn't just break the mold, it threatened the sale. Still poisoning a pond? That crossed a line no one believed Pendleton would dare approach. Not even Gary. Not at first. But the evidence kept mounting. He'd taken samples of the water and the residue and sent them to a colleague at the university lab where he used to guest lecture. A favor among scientists. The results came back in 3 days, and they left no doubt. A blend of glyphosate, a powerful herbicide, and aluminum sulfate, a compound often used in municipal water treatment, but toxic to aquatic ecosystems when unbalanced. The concentration was deliberate, lethal. Gary didn't need a courtroom to tell him what this was. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't runoff. It was a direct chemical assault, applied by someone who either didn't understand, or, worse, didn't care, what it would destroy. These weren't bugs in a vegetable garden. They were koi, sentient, delicate, bred and raised over years with patience and care. They had names, personalities. They came when Lucy called. Now Lucy, his daughter, his quiet, science-loving, fiercely observant girl, had locked herself in her room. Her college application essay was supposed to be about the koi pond, about healing the world one small ecosystem at a time. She'd already drafted the opening paragraph weeks ago. Now it meant nothing. Gary didn't knock on her door that night. He knew the silence said enough. He just sat outside by the empty pond, watching the moon's reflection shimmer on water that once teemed with life. The ache in his chest wasn't just grief, it was rage. Mark Pendleton hadn't just killed fish. He had shattered something sacred, a space that had become, for Gary and Lucy, a living monument to resilience and renewal, a place where things grew, where memories lived. Now it was toxic, polluted. Gary didn't cry. He clenched his fists and stared into the stillness, knowing this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Gary Olson wasn't the kind of man to scream or lash out. His anger didn't come in shouts. It came in quiet, deliberate action. So, no, he didn't storm into the HOA office. He didn't dial the local police and expect them to understand the chemical composition of a dying ecosystem. He went to someone who would, the Environmental Protection Agency. Gary logged into the EPA's Region 6 field reporting portal that very night. He used his real name, filed a formal complaint, and included every attachment he had: photographs of the dead fish, the lab analysis of the water samples, the soil toxicity levels, even photos of the punctured fence and the white chemical trail. But he didn't stop there. He referenced his past fieldwork ID from his time leading aquatic restoration teams on federal Superfund sites. That name still carried weight. The next morning, he mailed hard copies directly to an old contact in enforcement, an analyst named Rita Maloney, who owed him a favor from a site they'd saved years ago outside Houston. She called him within 24 hours. Her tone was low and clipped. "I've seen enough. If what you're alleging is true, and from these samples I believe it is, this isn't just an HOA dispute. It's unlawful hazardous material application without license or containment protocol. It's an environmental crime." Gary nodded silently. He already knew. But even as the EPA began quietly building their case, Gary went a step further. Thanks to a state law passed just a year earlier, after years of pressure from transparency advocates, homeowner associations were now considered subject to public information requests. Gary filed for the last 6 months of board minutes, expense reports, and contractor agreements. It took a week to get them, and when the envelope finally arrived, he read through them at his kitchen table with a highlighter in one hand and a black coffee in the other. Page after page, he saw typical HOA business: tree trimming, sidewalk repairs, maintenance billing. But then he found it, buried in a line item from 2 months ago: vegetation clearing services, emergency abatement, $2,500, Superior Turf Solutions. No vote recorded, no discussion, no notice to homeowners, and most importantly, no justification. 3 addresses were listed for treatment, and Gary's was one of them. He flipped through more records and found something worse. Superior Turf Solutions was not an official HOA contractor. It was a private landscaping outfit registered to Kenneth Elkins, Mark Pendleton's brother-in-law, a man with no state pesticide certification and no environmental disposal permits. Gary's hands trembled, not from fear, but from focused, burning rage. And then came the final piece. Buried in a neighborhood Facebook group, Gary found photos a neighbor had taken weeks earlier. Plastic drums and unmarked canisters being offloaded from a trailer into Pendleton's backyard. When questioned at the time, Pendleton had claimed they were fertilizers for personal use. But Gary recognized the markings. They weren't for fertilizer. They were for industrial-grade treatments, and some of them were illegal to store outside of locked containment. That night, Gary submitted his second complaint, this time marked urgent, to the EPA, attaching the new evidence. Falsified HOA expenses, connections to an unlicensed contractor, and photographs suggesting unregulated chemical storage and dumping. He didn't sleep. He didn't need to. Because 48 hours later, the response arrived. It started with a dark, unmarked pickup truck pulling quietly up to Pendleton's home. Moments later, 2 white EPA vans rolled in behind it. Agents stepped out. Then came the hazmat suits. Neighbors watched from porches and sidewalks as government agents erected containment tape around the side yard. A loud knock echoed through Pendleton's front door, followed by firm voices, calm, professional, but unmistakably serious. The same man who had once bragged about running the tightest HOA in the county now stood frozen on his porch in gym shorts and loafers, blinking in disbelief as agents unloaded equipment and began surveying his property. Gary watched from his own driveway. He didn't wave, he didn't gloat. But as the EPA officers opened Pendleton's garage and stepped back quickly, radioing for assistance, Gary felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in days: control, and the certainty that justice was only just beginning. The moment the EPA officers knocked on Mark Pendleton's front door, the neighborhood felt a shift. The same man who once paced the sidewalks with a clipboard and a self-appointed sense of importance now hesitated behind a screen door, trying to process what was happening. His smugness didn't just fade, it crumbled. Neighbors stepped out of their homes, quiet at first, curious. But once the hazmat team arrived and began taping off Pendleton's lawn, his immaculate, over-fertilized, trophy-winning zoysia lawn, the silence turned into murmurs. The agents moved with practiced precision. They didn't argue, didn't yell. They cordoned off the yard, marked the perimeter of the garage, and rolled out containment mats like they were handling something far more serious than suburban drama. And in a way, they were. Because what they uncovered beneath that lawn wasn't just a technical violation. It was a buried warning. 3 rusted canisters, partially corroded, hidden just inches beneath the topsoil. Each one still held chemical runoff, the same compounds Gary had found in his pond. And one of them had already started to leak. The EPA classified the site as a potential contamination hazard, given the proximity to shared greenbelt runoff channels and the stormwater drains that fed into a nearby wildlife corridor. In less than 2 hours, Pendleton's house was marked unsafe for occupancy, pending a full remediation assessment. He was asked to vacate the premises. There was no shouting, no grand resistance, just a man slowly backing down his own driveway, face pale, trying to process how the very tools he used to assert control had turned against him. But the consequences weren't over. The HOA's insurance provider declined coverage for all damages. The chemicals had been stored and applied without board approval, violating both state environmental codes and the HOA's own bylaws. Pendleton's unilateral contracts with Superior Turf Solutions, a company linked directly to his brother-in-law, became the focus of a formal investigation for unlicensed, hazardous waste handling. Within a week, the HOA board convened a special emergency session. Pendleton didn't attend. The vote to remove him as president passed 6-1. The lone dissenting vote came from a board member who resigned the following day. Gary, for his part, stayed out of the spectacle. While the suits cleared soil from the lawn next door, he quietly began rebuilding. He drained the poison pond completely, hauled in fresh gravel, reinstalled the filtration system, and rebalanced the pH using rainwater from the very barrels Pendleton had once tried to ban. And then, from a small, climate-controlled tank in his garage, his emergency hatchery, he released the first batch of preserved koi eggs. Lucy helped him lower the containers into the water. Her hands trembled a little from the chill, but her smile was back. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders relaxed. Her essay, she said, would need a new ending. One about resilience. 3 days later, Gary received a letter from the HOA board. It was short, direct, and signed by every remaining member. We deeply regret what occurred under former leadership. The board is grateful for your commitment to environmental safety and community integrity. Gary framed it, not out of pride, but as a reminder, systems only work when good people stand their ground. And when neighbors asked what exactly had happened to the old HOA president, the one who'd once barked about lawn length and mailbox styles, Gary didn't rant, he didn't brag, he'd just glance toward the pond, where bright specks of gold had started to dart beneath the surface again, and say, "Turns out koi aren't the only ones sensitive to poison." Then he'd smile and let the silence do the rest.